Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I am Sebastian Burka, Associate Director of the Stigler Center, and today we are happy to host Cristina Caffarra, William Kovacic, and Lynn in a conversation on antitrust and economic liberty, moderated by Jacob Schlesinger. This conversation is part of our Antitrust and Competition webinar series on monopolies and politics, which replaces our annual in-person conference. And we will announce more events in the series in the coming months. Before we begin, please note we are on the record and we will post the event video on our YouTube channel later. If you have any questions for the speakers, we will try to address them in the last 15 minutes or so, and you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And we hope to see you for more upcoming webinars, including the next installment in our series, Freedom of Speech, Hong Kong and the Future of US-China Relations, which will feature Jimmy Lai and Steve Davis on October 22nd. Please check our website for more events, as well as our publication, promarket.org, and our Capitalism podcast, co-hosted by our faculty director, Luigi Zingales, and acclaimed investigative journalist, Bethany McLean. And back to this afternoon, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Cristina Caffarra is an economist who has worked on cases before the agencies and the courts across Europe for over 20 years. Kovacic is the Global Competition Professor of Law and Policy at George Washington University Law School. Lynn is the Executive Director of the Open Markets Institute and author of a new book entitled Liberty from All Masters, which is available for sale from the Seminary Co-op. So please see the event page for more details. And last but not least, our moderator today is Jacob Schlesinger, who is a senior correspondent at the Wall Street Journal and was a 2018 Stigler Center Journalist in Residence Fellow. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to the speakers. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sebastian, and thank all of you for showing up today and logging in. Our topic today is a big one. It's a question that's getting growing attention from both the political right and left. President Trump's antitrust enforcers periodically invoke the phrase economic liberty. Maureen Ohlhausen, shortly after being named as the acting chair of the Federal Trade Commission, in early 2017 gave a speech titled Advancing Economic Liberty and touted a new FTC Economic Liberty Task Force. Later that year, Makan Delrahim, head of the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, gave a speech titled Economic Liberty and the Rule of Law. Democrats running the US House of Representatives Judiciary Committee recently released a sweeping report on competition in digital markets, including a whole section on economic liberty. But while people across the ideological spectrum now use the term, they seem to give a different meaning. Ms. Ohlhausen was focused on professional licensing and labor markets. Mr. Delrahim talked in part of the need to find a balance in antitrust enforcement between fostering competition and avoiding infringing on the economic liberties of the companies under scrutiny. To House Democrats, it's the corporate giants, at least the tech ones, who threaten economic liberty, and they make the case that antitrust should be wielded more aggressively to constrain them. That's also the argument of a new organization launched earlier this year called the American Economic Liberties Project, which is devoted to advocating more antitrust enforcement. We have a great and balanced panel today to help sift through all of this. Each of them will be giving opening remarks of about 10 minutes to be followed by a conversation among the panelists for 20 to 30 minutes. We'll then open it up to questions from the audience submitted to us through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. One of our speakers, Lynn, as Sebastian mentioned, has just published a new book just 3 weeks ago titled Liberty from All Masters, The New American Autocracy versus the Will of the People. So Barry, since you're freshest on the market addressing this theme, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. It's a great introduction, and thank you all. It's a great honor to be here today. Luigi, Guy, Sebastian, Asher, all the folks at Stigler, you guys have done such a great job of building a fundamental community and conversation for dealing with this fantastically important topic. I also want to thank my friends Christina and Bill, from whom I have learned so much in recent years. Today I'm going to just, start off by making 3 points. And, the first is that anti-monopoly is political. Second, neoliberalism was designed to hide private corporate power. Third, we can begin to master every crisis we face today through smarter anti-monopoly enforcement and law. And I think that I'll add another one just because of your introduction. I would actually just take the word economic off economic liberty. I think what we're talking about here is liberty. It's about fundamental individual liberties. That's the threat that we face today, is to our basic liberties. Anyway, just to start, anti-monopoly is how we manage power in society. It is how we determine how individuals and groups of individuals compete with one another and to what ends. Anti-monopoly is political economics. Political economics is anti-monopoly. Let's make this absolutely clear in political terms. Anti-monopoly is foundational to rule of law and to all liberty and democracy. We see this in the first anti-monopoly action, the Statute of Monopolies of 1623, when Parliament took from the king the license to create and destroy monopolies at will. In the US context, anti-monopoly was the core achievement of the founding. The Declaration, the Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, these are the great original documents of anti-monopoly. These are what empowered Americans to grow and expand our liberty and prosperity and democracy for 200 years. Since the Second World War, anti-monopoly has also been a foundation on which Europeans have built their liberties and their prosperity. Let's not forget one legacy of the American occupation is Germany's embrace of New Deal era anti-monopoly principles to protect democracy and to keep the peace. Since the Second War, anti-monopoly, with its focus on distribution of risk and capacity, has also provided humans with the ability to build complex international systems that, even when tightly coupled, are truly resilient. In other words, anti-monopoly has provided us with the intellectual and legal tools that we need to promote harmonious communication and cooperation among peoples. This is the core argument I make in my new book, which you mentioned, Liberty from All Masters. Liberty, just, since this is a community that cares about these issues very intimately, liberty is the first full description in more than 50 years of the history and purpose of anti-monopolism, or rather what I call the American system of liberty. In the 1970s, the neoliberals had a simple goal. It was to concentrate power and control in the hands of a few. To achieve this, they targeted many institutions. The Union of the Working Person, for instance. Mainly, they aimed at anti-monopoly law. Until the 1980s, anti-monopoly law was based on simple, bright line rules designed so anybody could understand them. In the case of essential networks, there were strict limits on behavior and structure. In the case of industrial corporations, a 25% limit on market share. In the case of farming and retail, true protection of the family-sized business. The neoliberals knew not to attack anti-monopoly law directly. There are simply too many such laws. Instead, they proposed a new philosophy to govern how we understand the purpose of all anti-monopoly law. Rather than liberty and democracy for the citizen, the neoliberals said the main goal should be efficiency for the material welfare of the consumer. To buttress this idea, the neoliberals said that only specially trained economists had the ability to properly measure these material benefits of competition. To further buttress this idea, the neoliberals reconceived the very purpose of law itself in economic terms. As Robert Bork put it in 1978, antitrust is a science. As Richard Posner put it in 1986, the true meaning of justice is efficiency. The audacity of the neoliberal rhetoric would have shocked even Orwell. Concentrated private power, that's just the market. Control and manipulation by the monopolist, that's freedom. The true measure of justice, efficiency, measured scientifically. And yet in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan wrote these ideas into US antitrust law. And in the 1990s, Bill Clinton wrote these ideas into how we regulate banking and communications and energy and trade. What the neoliberals achieved was nothing less than an intellectual coup d'etat that overthrew the ideological foundations of the American Republic. And given the centrality of the United States in the post-war system, this coup affected every democracy in the world. The same United States that once shared its system of liberty and prosperity with all democratic nations now bullied the world to accept a system of autocratic corporate rule over our economies, our societies, our citizens. And the results have been truly counter-revolutionary. Over the last 35 years, we have seen the expropriation of millions of independent farmers and entrepreneurs, the capture of control over our communications and news media, the sacking of our industrial arts and our healthcare systems, the breakdown of international cooperation, the corruption of our science, the destruction of our climate. Today, we stand in the rubble of our democracies, extorted and manipulated by the most powerful corporations in history, fires burning our farmlands and forests around us. And still so many of the economists, staring through the rose-colored lenses of their instruments, using, in the words of Pope Francis, their magical thinking, still so many of them say, Amen, it is good. You know, as many of you know, I got into this line of work by studying how concentration makes complex systems unstable and subject to catastrophic collapse. That was the essential warning of my book, End of the Line, in 2005, which focused especially on the international trade system. In Cornered in 2010, I went further and looked at what happens when monopolization is combined with shareholder control. I call the result the economics of destruction. Given the lessons we are learning from COVID-19, I'd like to take a moment to discuss the fact that my warnings about how concentration creates massive physical risk have been largely borne out. I'll focus briefly on three acts that reinforce the main point. First, the monopolists destroyed vital industrial capacity. We did not even have the ability to manufacture 10-cent masks or 20-cent tests, we found out after the pandemic started. Second, the monopolists destroyed resiliency by concentrating what capacity remained, all those active pharmaceutical ingredient plants in China, just for instance. Third, the monopolists destroyed our ability to use simple common sense to understand what is actually happening in our society and our world by using their cash to reconstruct our economic and legal academies around the lies of the neoliberals. In more practical terms, in their successful effort to hide the exercise of power, the neoliberals also destroyed most of our ability to understand how corporations and markets work, hence to understand how the system is actually engineered. Let's be absolutely clear about who are the true defenders of science today. Earlier, I spoke of how neoliberalism is science masquerading as justice. It is worse than that. It is anti-science masquerading as science. Thomas Piketty cut to the heart of the matter in Capital. The discipline of economics has yet to get over its childish passion for purely theoretical and often highly ideological speculation, he wrote. Most mathematical models, he added, are no more than an exercise for masking the vacuity of the content. The ultimate lesson of COVID-19, vacuity matters. Or rather, ideas matter and facts matter. The neoliberal ideology applied to the real world has thrown us as individuals and as a community into darkness. And in this darkness, we have stumbled close to the precipice. Let's be very clear. We simply got lucky this time. The breakdowns we have seen could have been far worse. People in America and around the world are rising against monopoly. We see this dramatically in the Cicilline Committee report. We see this in the investigation of Google by all 50 states. You know, I can go on and on. But speed is of the essence. This is true because of the pressing nature of physical threats such as climate change and the percolating supply chain war between the United States and China that will continue no matter who wins the election. But the most pressing threats of all are political. We must move forward now against Google, Facebook, and Amazon, lest we soon lose our ability to concentrate our own thinking and our own power as a people to act. To do what we must do, we must first wipe neoliberalism from our law and our thinking. There is no compromise possible. The difference is religious in nature. Either all is metaphysical and our hands are tied by little demigods and sprites, or it is political and we have the power to address every threat. That is our opportunity to see the power that we have in our own hands and our own minds to fix every fundamental problem we face today. It's time to get down to work. It's time to relearn the American system of liberty.
Thank you very much, Barry. That was a great and powerful way to get us started. Bill, I'm not going to ask you to defend the demigods and sprites, but I will turn the microphone over to you and give us your perspective on the big question of whether antitrust should and how it should address economic liberty.
I don't get many chances to talk to demigods or sprites or even their agents. It's hard to get in touch with them. Thanks to Stigler for the opportunity to do this and to be part of the panel, to be with Christina, with Barry. I've been reading this fascinating new book that we just mentioned. There we go. Yes, there it is. And it's invigorating, informative, and enormously provocative. I think that's what good writing's supposed to do. It's supposed to cause you to think and rethink, even to the point of a little bit of distress. So thank you, Barry. And thanks for getting us off to a great start. In a way, the topic we have is, in a sense, there's a very easy answer to it, which is to say, of course. And the of course answer about the importance of economic liberty just runs through a large, diverse literature and jurisprudence in our history. If you want to find expressions of concern for economic liberty as a cornerstone of US antitrust law, you find it in lots of cases. Just one memorable quote from a tying case the federal government brought to the Supreme Court in the 1950s. The Sherman Act was designed to be a comprehensive charter of economic liberty, aimed at preserving free and unfettered competition as the rule of trade. These expressions of concern appear regularly in the jurisprudence. And what's the intuition behind it? I'd say there are a number of objectives, but one that's unmistakable is indeed to provide a permeable system in the economy so that people with skills, especially with entrepreneurial DNA, have a chance to realize its fullest expression. That DNA is not handed out in a systematic way. You don't fill out a chart in the prenatal period in which you say, I'd like some of these and some of those. You get it or you don't. You can enhance it with your own labors. And I think the general view behind the statutes and a lot of other public policy is that if you are allowed to develop it and apply it, it will make the nation more prosperous, because all who have capacity, and even humble capacity, will get an opportunity to realize it. It will have a more favorable distribution of opportunity, and thus a more favorable distribution of wealth. And I think a last assumption is that it's a source of greater personal satisfaction. That is, we might grumble about working and doing things, but I think work is a source of deep personal satisfaction. It's a creative expression, whether or not you're baking the world's best coffee cake, pouring the world's best cup of coffee, or writing Liberty from All Masters. I dare say Barry probably enjoyed doing this, and doing it gives him a sense of satisfaction, as it does many authors. And if you give people an opportunity, a society an opportunity to realize those possibilities, I would suggest not only is it more prosperous, is the wealth distributed more broadly, but in a basic way, that I can't prove by any rigorous methodology, it is a society that has a greater sense of personal fulfillment. All reasons that economic liberty is important, and why competition law has a key role to play, as Northern Pacific said decades ago, in fulfilling it. As you suggested, Jake, there are two concerns. You know, how can this liberty be choked off? How can this opportunity be forestalled? Again, the broad, diverse literature recognizes two paths. One is through private restrictive behavior that chokes off opportunities for people who have those capabilities to realize them and fulfill them. That's one. And the other is through public means. And what is the public path? Powerful economic interests have motives to go to elected officials and say, give me shelter. And they're good at it. They've explored a lot of ways to develop that. And it's another path, another channel, another window you can go to obtain the kind of protection that you want from the competitive forces that would press you to behave in a more imaginative, creative way. And it's again on the public side, it's a diverse literature. It's Walter Adams writing in the early 1950s. It's Gabriel Coco in the 1960s saying, beware of regulatory intervention and watch who asks for it and how they set it up. It's Ralph Nader in the 1960s and 70s. Ralph Nader writing a book with his colleagues called The Monopoly Makers. Who are they? They're public institutions. And most recently, it's Deborah Healy and Eleanor Fox writing from a global perspective about how the state can be an enemy of competition when it is captured by and made the servant of these kinds of interests. So generally speaking, what does an effective competition policy have to do? It's got to address both of these. And that if you only forestall one path in the adaptable way that they're seeking to protect themselves from this process of competitive discipline, they'll go to the other. And a lot of history shows they're pretty good at using both. So that's the easy answer to the question. Is it important? Yes. If it weren't, I'm not sure what we have all done for a living for quite a while in working on this. So how to get there? What to do? One of the things I like so much about what Barry and his colleagues have done, and he acknowledges them, is they've drawn our attention back to our history and asked us to examine it in great detail. And it's a captivating story. Matt Stoller's Goliath is probably the other contender for real distinction in this area, having done the same thing. I'd say it's an provocative but incomplete history. And what I wonder in looking at the hypothesis that Barry has laid out for us is outliers that don't fit in quite well. That is, what happened in the 70s? That is, why did it happen? Was it just this neoliberal impulse? Having been a child in part of that era, actually of the 60s, I can remember other, how did an efficiency perspective become popular? That was not a decade in which people thought the economy was doing really well. There are horrible petroleum shocks in 69 and 73 that really deal the economy a shattering blow. By the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency, inflation, interest rates are going through the roof. In the mid-70s, there is a view that American firms and American technology has lost its ability to compete effectively with significant rivals in consumer electronics and automobiles in Germany and in Japan in particular. That led, I think, a lot of people to wonder, why aren't we getting more mileage for our efforts in public policy? And it was a pretty broad group of people who asked questions about antitrust law and existing doctrine. Did they all come up with good answers? But I can't vouch for that. I can't prove that. But part of the impulse was the sense that the country was losing ground and losing it in a dangerous way, well before Ronald Reagan ever came to Washington. I'll just put another example on the table that makes me wonder, of all the illustrations that we talk about, the automobile industry doesn't figure very much in those discussions. And again, if we go back to the critique of competition policy, and mind you, it's hard to find an era in our history when you find commentators saying it's really working well. That is, the perspective that Barry brings to this is not congruent with the point of view of contemporary observers who complained about it all the time and said that the menace of concentration was still unchecked and that the nation was at risk. With a vitality and power that Barry brings to this, many of those commentators at the time said we are in exactly the same precarious state of danger with respect to our economy and to our political system. It is not a sanguine assessment of the competition system. But one of the targets of debate was automobiles and how General Motors and an increasingly elite group that we called the Big Four, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and American Motors, were choking off the industry. I'd say generally Americans today have many more choices than they did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s. A lot more direct foreign investment in the United States. Many more opportunities and choices about the vehicles. Without trying to make the case and say that's a great equilibrium, or that our carbon-based economy is ideal and we're not suffering in a lot of ways from that, I wouldn't say that. But a question I have in mind is, none of that would have happened if it were quite so dire. And I guess a question I would like to explore more in that and other instances, in the spirit of the empirical inquiry and history-based examination that Barry puts before us legitimately as a good basis for analysis, is how did that happen? Why did it happen? And why, in many ways, is the automobile sector today so much better than it was when I was a child in Detroit growing up in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s? Thanks.
All right, well, thanks, Bill. You've clearly laid the groundwork for a good exchange down the line. But before we get to that, and I'm sure Barry will want a chance to respond, we want to hear from Christina, who has a lot of great thoughts on this, to give us more of a global perspective and also to weigh in on some of these questions. So Christina, over to you.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you to Stigler. It's a great pleasure to be here, particularly indeed in the company of Barry and Bill, great friends and inspirations when I listen to them. I bring to this a European perspective, and this is indeed a global conversation. There is an inflection in the way we think about antitrust globally, certainly very active in Europe, and dare I say it, I think that some of the developments I'll sketch later in Europe make us think that we are in some ways quite ahead of the curve in thinking about these developments. And in part, I want to start from of course, giving you a bit of an historic perspective about where we started, where are we, and where we're going. The purpose of this discussion is really to gauge the sense to which the notion of economic liberties is really a goal as a purpose in antitrust. In Europe, you see, this is not something which is novel or unknown. I mean, if I look at the past, the freedom of economic choice was actually the starting point. The foundation of antitrust enforcement in Europe was in no way US antitrust. It really was an indigenous product of ideas that were developed in Germany in the 1920s, a version of liberalism that is known as ordoliberalism, which really had at its core the notion of the freedom of economic choice, a view that only if you have decentralized decision-making and not concentrated power, you could deliver good outcomes. And in this view, in this ordoliberal view, competition is seen as a process of rivalry built indeed on these economic freedoms, in which the state has an important role because left to its own devices, the freedom of producers may well lead to cartels and increase in economic power, which is a threat to economic freedom. So competition policy is important to restrain this market power and guarantee competition as a process. And this idea is what inspired the original German competition law, which is also at the foundation of the European competition law, which became part of our sort of architecture in the late 50s with the Treaty of Rome. And much of that original thinking was really translated into the way we embraced antitrust to begin with. So the notion that you need to have freedom of choice means that you need to have markets that are sufficiently deconcentrated. And so in this kind of logic, a notion of market structure of decentralized production is important. And we started off with a lot of presumptions that had to do with level of concentration and level of market share. The notion of abuse itself, the concept of violation that we pursue, originally really had at its core, but as I'll say, it remains the case, a notion of conduct that has a substantial effect on the structure of the market, on the structure of competition. A lot of our case law contains these multiple statements about the need to protect residual competition against the strategies of companies with market power to preserve this freedom of choice. Then we had the swing towards what was called the new economic approach, right? These are American welfare, consumer welfare ideas kind of landed in Europe in the late 80s, early 90s. And really there was a major push there to replace these original values with a more economic welfare base. And there was, I mean, I was part in many ways of that push, because when I came into this, it really was that kind of time. And we, as economists, were coming into the field. There was a great sense that we really needed to replace this formalistic, old-fashioned, unrigorous, philosophical approach to competition with something which was more disciplined. We don't want to protect competition because that doesn't make any sense. If you protect competition, you're protecting inefficient competitors. You just want to protect efficiency. And that became very much the inspiring principle. And anything that was originally ordoliberal and in our original statutes and in our case law was pushed back quite hard, in the sense that it became synonymous with this unsophisticated look at the silly Germans who look at market shares thresholds, haha. But then I think while we managed to shift, or there was a sort of move of the dial in that direction towards a more economic approach, as it's become known in Europe, it wasn't as complete in my perception as it has been in the United States. I think that the notion of economics has been layered over that original thinking, and the system that we have ended up with today is in some sense still a bit of a hybrid regime, in which, yes, we haven't really kind of defaulted entirely towards a Chicago sort of set of principles, or at least a notion of consumer welfare in a narrow sense as being the guiding light. And in reality, what much of our case law still does is looking at those kind of ideas that I described, the idea of economic freedom and freedom of choice of individuals. And there's a lot in our enforcement, in our competition law that is broader than, of course, consumer welfare. We still have a strong tradition in Europe of pursuing other goals, such as European market integration. That is known as being a very important objective, which was being pursued also through antitrust rules. There is an established notion that dominant firms have a special responsibility towards smaller competitors. And so conduct which is not problematic if it's pursued by a small firm, or a smaller firm, becomes really problematic. And this is deeply ingrained, the notion of special responsibility. There's an inherent notion of fairness, which underlies some of what still we do, some of what the courts have actually baked into the case law, and therefore the way in which enforcers are pursuing cases. The notion that somehow one needs to just be careful about conduct that is inherently unfair because it weakens the ability of others to compete. So incidentally, this is a reason why our antitrust enforcement in in time has continued to be viewed as something of a quirky thing, something of a bit of a quaint, not pure, not rigorous sort of discipline by Americans. Have been in multiple discussions, of course, in which the general sort of tone was, but you in Europe protect competitors, you don't protect competition. You've done the Google shopping case, but you did stuff like self-preferencing. What even is that? We don't recognize that. So, you know, you do quaint things in Europe that you don't really kind of call proper antitrust over here, but in reality, there is a basis for this and reflects the sort of the origins of where we come from. Now, the final kind of piece of this puzzle is where this is all going. And this is really a super interesting question because, as I said at the beginning, there is a moment of significant upheaval, a major tsunami, which is underway in Europe, which is a revisitation of antitrust and indeed a massive way of ex-ante regulation, which is being written. And it is in so many ways trying to make up for a sense that both, in fact, the sort of the components of the slightly hybrid system, both the narrow application of welfarist technical economics and the residual application of all the liberal ideas ultimately have failed to deliver, failed to curb the growth of market power, have been unable to deal with the current phenomena, and will continue likely to fail. So there's multiple factors that motivate this sense that we really need to move on and to do things somewhat differently. I just sort of mention a couple. One is the well-known sense that in mergers, there's been this crazy narrowing down of focus, looking at very narrow markets, defining market narrowly and pretending that concentration of entire sectors can be solved by divesting here and there, the gerrymandering, some sort of remedy here and there. And what has happened is that we presided over a sequence of concentrative moves in which entire sectors have gone from being reasonably less concentrated to very concentrated now, from pharmaceuticals to chemicals to agrochemicals to commodities in many ways. So there has been, certainly in Europe, a very big sense, which is common to the United States, that we've done that not well, and the tools that we've applied have not been applied well. In conduct, in antitrust, you would say, not outside of mergers, you know, there is a deep sense that we are stuck, because particularly the emergence of the digital giants has accelerated this notion that applying these narrow economic tests is not remotely capable of capturing what worries us today. We are looking at markets that are not in the process of tipping. We're looking at markets that have tipped. So we have 3-4 attention brokers that soak up most of our attention. And what antitrust we try to apply with good intention has been completely unequal to the task of preventing these kind of unprecedented expansion of size and power. And, you know, frankly, we have seen that we haven't delivered because in part we have remedies that have not been able to really apply meaningfully. We have had a number of cases in which the solution has been cease and desist, and we know the rest is history. There is absolutely no capability of those remedies to deliver a market solution. There has been, of course, a great deal of length that is built into these processes. They take too long. And fundamentally, there is also reluctance to really act on things like exploitation. What is the main concern we have when we talk about digital giants is the enormous unevenness of their power relative to those who rely on them for doing business, for which a category of exploitation appears to be the best fitting, but there is reluctance on the part of regulators, certainly in Europe, at the least at the level of the European Commission. The national member states are somewhat different, I'll talk about it in a moment, to actually move away from the traditional leveraging foreclosure stories a la Microsoft to proper exploitative abuse. So that really hasn't caught up and hasn't caught fire in any sort of sense. So where are we? Now we are in a world in which we are basically doing a major tilt towards ex-ante regulation in the knowledge, following the observation that however well-meaning, however well-intentioned antitrust, motivated either by ordoliberal principles or by ultimately economic approach has not worked. And so we are seeing a major upsurge of regulation, which is being drafted as we speak in the regulatory parts of the European Commission, not DG competition. There is another series of places in which this regulation is being drafted, long gray lists, black lists of what is allowed and what isn't allowed are being put together, that they will see the light, I think, at the end of the year or beginning of next year in the Digital Markets Act. Final point, what is happening then to antitrust regulators faced with this enormous land grab on the part of the regulator. So what's happening to the agencies? They're facing with a big land grab and a potential loss of authority and power. So what we're seeing is that they are actually significantly powering up themselves, their own antitrust powers in the direction of some regulation. So you have Germany. Germany has always been fairly auto-liberal in its approach. They are changing the competition law in a way that embodies more, simplifying, a bit more sort of regulatory capabilities. The same is true of the UK. They've announced that they will incorporate a digital regulation effectively in the way they do antitrust enforcement. The same is true of France, which is certainly being a big actor in this space. And at the EC, we're seeing that the DG competition is trying to catch up with the other directorates that are more regulatory based by trying to kind of develop its own competition tool, which is a bit more of a regulatory hybrid to try and not be left behind with the traditional tools. So, conclusion, Europe at the moment is a complete cauldron of experimentation in this field. And are we going to go back to more older liberal ideas of individual freedom of choice, that we need to be protected against concentration of power, some more bright line presumptions, or instead of everything case by case? Well, maybe in some sense in the regulation we'll see more of that. But I think the big question is going to be concentrating on the design of this regulation and the division of labor between regulation and antitrust, which is the big act for the next few months. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christina. That was a fantastic overview of what's going on in Europe as a compare and contrast. We're going to now have a bit of a conversation among the four of us. And just a reminder to the audience that we will take questions from the audience and try and leave some time for that at the end. Please submit questions through the Q&A button. We're already getting some good ones. At the risk of falling into a Chris Wallace mode, though, I'd like to actually turn to Barry and give him a little bit of a chance to respond to some of Bill's comments and perhaps Christina's as well, whichever ones you want briefly, on the questions of what, whether it's an incomplete history and whether you want to address whether the auto industry does or doesn't offer a counterfactual to the themes that you've laid out.
Yeah, no, and actually it's a great it's a great opportunity that Bill gave us actually to understand the larger framework of anti-monopoly, which is, and how it connects to what we might, antitrust, which is, I remember the cars of the 1970s very well. My family was a car family. We worked on cars. We played around a lot with cars. There were some amazing cars, but there were also some terrible cars, and they didn't last long, and they cost a lot of money. And absolutely, the cars we have today are in much better shape than they were. They're much better machines than they were. Now, just a couple points, and it's what happened there was we opened up trade. We imported a lot more cars. We sort of allowed for many more cars to come from Japan, from Germany, from France, from Italy, from Korea, and that was a political decision. And what it demonstrates is that trade is a subset of competition policy. Those conversations in the mid-70s, there was conversation. Should we take antitrust law and use it against General Motors, or should we let the Japanese bring their cars in? And people said, well, in terms of the American buyer, you get the same and perhaps a better sort of outcome from letting the Japanese and the Germans bring their cars in. So that was just a different way to get competition. The competition improves the value of competition. I would encourage people to understand that the lack of competition policy in this space has actually led to massive concentration in the supplier base. That's a different issue, but you know, but again, it's like it's important. You know, it's important to say, hey, yes, absolutely. One of the purposes of competition is to promote lower prices and to promote innovation. And, you know, we say that all the time, and I've written about that extensively. But, you know, let me just, I'm going to quote something that this is a statement by our friend, Senator Sherman, John Sherman, from a speech he gave in 1890 in defense of the law that bears his name. And this is actually, it ties into our conversations about economic liberties also, because it is the right of every man to work, labor, and produce in any lawful vocation, and to transport his production on equal terms and conditions and under like circumstances. This is industrial liberty and lies at the foundation of the equality of all rights and privileges. That's a pretty good statement about the purpose of anti-monopoly law. It gets at the issue of you know, that this is basically like, you know, what Bill was saying before, that this is a matter of like being able to do what you want. Yes, it's absolutely that, but it's also you know, that this is fundamentally about our democracy. And you know, just, you know, we should understand, going back to the beginning, why was it? This is, you know, what it's important to keep our focus on the core issue, which is, why was it that in the very beginning of our nation, in one of the first laws that was passed by our nation after the creation of the Constitution, the goal was to take the properties of the United States and chop them up into little pieces of land 160 acres large, and to give them out to each individual family, and then to protect those families against corporations and speculators. That was one of the first laws. It was passed by the first Congress. It was signed into law by President Washington. Madison told us, he goes, the purpose of this is so that we have as many independent people who understand how markets work, how power works, so that, because those people are the buttress, it's the foundation of our democracy. They're the people who are going to know how to go out and fight to keep ourselves free and to keep ourselves, keep our democracy functioning. So the idea was to have this sort of holistic, positive cycle in which liberty sort of makes liberty, free people make free people from generation to generation. And it was very clear at the beginning. It was very clear when during the refounding of anti-monopoly in the 100 years ago under Brandeis. Efficiency is important, but if efficiency gets in the way of democracy, democracy must stand first.
All right, thank you, Barry. I want to bring in Bill and Christina, and let me channel the conversation though a little bit, and playing off of what Barry had just said. One of the things that Barry had said in his early remarks was, and I hesitate to paraphrase you, Barry, so I apologize in advance for getting it a little bit wrong, but in a sense that antitrust policy took a wrong turn with the narrowing of a focus on economics and on the consumer welfare standard. Bill, you were for a time a policy practitioner under that framework, and Christina, you are a self-confessed economist who injected economic thinking into antitrust theory for many years. I wondered if you could both talk about whether you think the consumer welfare standard was a mistake, whether, even if, as Barry has implied, it might bring us efficiency, that there is fundamentally a conflict between efficiency and a focus on consumer welfare and economic liberty, which is the topic that we have before us today, or whether you think that's a false trade-off and a false economy, that in fact you can have both, and perhaps consumer welfare actually enhances economic liberty. Whichever one of you wants to go first.
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I've sometimes despaired in our discussions about modern policy that we're trapped in definitions that are counterproductive. I mean, I can only give you my idiosyncratic individual experience in thinking about what this phrase meant. As a as a junior case handler in the engine room from 1979 to 1983 at the FTC, to the point where I got to stand on the bridge when I was on the board at a later time. I know that it's a term that's loaded with so much freight, and it's heavy to drag around. And I think we almost need a new vocabulary to capture what happened. At all times in my 4 incarnations at the FTC and as an observer from the outside, I can just think of so many instances in which the consumer welfare framework, which was avowedly accepted, encompassed concerns about quality, acutely concerns about innovation. I am amused. I go back and look at that. I read so often in publications where an author or commentator, smart people too, these aren't idiots, so I have to take it seriously, say consumer welfare, which means only price and output effects, period. Or the US is trapped in a framework that is only concerned with price and output effects, period. I have to go looking through. I mean, you can sort of see here, I've got boxes of stuff here. I go back and look at my own case files and read complaints and say, wait a minute, that talked about innovation. Or yes, I see it so often that I start to think that I've been living in a different universe on that. So one reaction I have is that in a lot of instances, matters certainly that I've worked on through my lifetime did have a concern about innovation, and it was featured prominently in the discussion. Now, a point that Barry has raised is that, okay, so you did, were you applying that framework in a sensible way? That's another proper debatable question. And those of us who had the public policy jobs should have no reluctance to stand in front of an audience and take on one at a time each example of where we are said to have failed. But was the framework so confining that it ignored quality, innovation, or yes, worker interests? Not a chance. I mean, it was flexible. Whether it was applied correctly is a different issue. And just the thought about how economics comes into the system, I'm fascinated by a figure that Barry brings out in this wonderful book, and Matt Stoller in particular is focused on, is the role of Ralph Nader in changing our view about what policy should be in the 1970s, in the late 60s. Ralph Nader is the guy who said consumer first, consumer first. I'd almost argue he has as much to do with putting the citizen as consumer in the center of the universe as Bob Bork did with the antitrust paradox. That Nader mentioned it so often. A number of his formative books, one, The Closed Enterprise System, early in the 70s, I think Mark Green may have been the lead author on it, but it was Ralph's organization, said the big problem with antitrust today is that it's the damn lawyers. The lawyers don't have any guts, and it's the economists who see things clearly. And the economics he was speaking about is the economics that is a direct descendant from Joe Bain to Len Weiss to the future, embodied by Kazin and Turner in the late 50s. It says, you've got a big concentration problem here, and don't kid yourselves. And the only way to fix it is to use structural remedies to fix that. And the Nader prescription is bring more economics into the decision to set priorities. And lots of the administrative apparatus to do that was put in place. The catch was that Ralph didn't see is that what happens if you get a new style of economics into the picture? That's not Bain, that's not Weiss, that is not even sort of a Mike Shearer of the 1970 volume Industrial Organization and Economic Performance, 50 years old this year, a landmark. What if those guys aren't the economists you're talking about anymore, and you get a different economics in the system? Here's the machinery you've set up so that they have influence, and now they are driving the machine. That wasn't anticipated. But there was a great calling for more economics, because the economics baseline of this period, from the post-war period that Barry's referring to, was extremely sympathetic to the use of broad structural cases and legislation to deconcentrate American industry. The machinery was designed not by the neoliberals. It was designed by those saying, go get them. But those weren't the people who drove the machines.
So I want to bring Christina in, but I am compelled, as I've been monitoring the questions from the audience, to inject one now because it comes from Luigi Zingales. And since he runs the center, I guess he is, in some ways, has the concentration of control over the microphone as well.
He owns this microphone as
right, he paid for this microphone. And he says, question for Bill, I buy that consumer welfare includes innovation and quality, but what about liberty?
I think it was certainly in our minds. I mean, where am I coming from? I'm a Harlan Blake student from Columbia, the Blake and Bowman debate. I spent 1975 and 76 working for Phil Hart on the Industrial Organization Reorganization Act, the Petroleum Industry Competition Act of 1976, and the Hart-Scott-Rodino Antitrust Improvements Act. So this is where I grew up. And I'm watching the policy debate at this time, and I would say the implicit in this notion of welfare, implicit in the notion of the consumer as the focus of attention, not yet consumer welfare, but Ralph Nader style consumer as the focus. What was the meaning of that? The meaning was that if you promoted an environment in which these capabilities could be realized, you had tremendous byproduct. You mean call it a direct product or byproduct that did generate the freedom to allow individuals who had good ideas to realize their fullest expression. So in the environment, and this is idiosyncratic biography, I'm not asserting this as a general principle, but when I think of these words, and when I think of Luigi's principle and think of, well, what about this value? I would say the value structure that I was familiar with was imbued with the expectation that freedom was an unmistakable ingredient and result of the pursuit of the consumer interest with respect to price, quality, innovation.
All right, thank you. Christina, please. Oh, Barry, let me just give Christina a chance and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, well, I'm always amused by Barry's view of economists as stakeholder merchants, much of which, I resonates with me, and I have a view that many of the economists become economic advocates, and what they do is cookie cutter and essentially glorified law. But going back to the beginning, I think that in Europe, again, the notion of economic liberty was at the foundation of what we were doing. Then I recall very vividly going around Europe in the 90s, talking to lawyers and enforcers and explaining that some of what was being done was really quite hand-wavy and unrigorous. It was incorporating values that were a bit confusing, that didn't feel as if they entirely belonged there. Values around public interest tests, other types of values, and we, the economists, had ways to think about some of these things in a manner that was slightly more rigorous. Now, I think that we have gone probably too far, and I don't want to reenact the debate about consumer welfare because I share with Bill the view this debate is being had kind of to death. And in Europe, we certainly do not, and I think also in the United States, ever we never did embrace a notion of narrow price and output. But there was merit to some of it, because of course, by the time we came into this, there was a universal view that every conceivable form of vertical integration was inevitably anti-competitive. Well, I mean, there are some nuances there. I think we've gone too far, and we cannot kind of use the sort of Chicago view as a justification for vertical integration by dominant firms, but there is some notion that we need to be a little bit more subtle. So, I mean, I think the debate is being had. I think in Europe, certainly we kind of pile in there notions of quality, notions of innovation, all of that is in there. And economics has gone too far in some of the ways to just kind of narrow it down, becoming advocacy. That is a different question. There's nothing particularly terrible with the tool if the tool is used in a meaningful way with principles.
Great.
So that's what I am.
Thank you. Barry, you wanted to weigh in, and I'll just say if you could keep it relatively brief, only because we're getting flooded with a lot of great questions and we have about 15 minutes left, but go ahead.
You know, I mean, I think that what Bill did by bringing in Ralph Nader is especially important. And, Bill wrote a really fantastic article 15 years ago, The Intellectual DNA of Modern U.S. Competition Law for Dominant Firm Conduct, the Chicago-Harvard double helix. I strongly recommend that. Bill and I are largely in agreement about that history. I actually want to just very briefly bring in another player in this, which is, he was actually in some ways more important than Nader. Nader was kind of, just made a lot of mistakes. Nader was kind of a fool within in the larger debate. There was somebody who had a very clear understanding of what he wanted to achieve, and that was John Kenneth Galbraith. And, what did John Kenneth Galbraith want to achieve? He made it very clear. You go back and read his books from the, Economics and the Public Purpose, mid-1970s. He wanted to achieve a command and control vision of the political economy, in which there, basically it was almost like a Soviet-style vision. There was going to be a massive concentration across the board. You're going to have state enterprises that run most productive and retail activities, and the state runs those activities directly. I mean, it's a terrifically terrifying vision, but it was a vision that goes straight back to Teddy Roosevelt, bull mooseism, 1912. It's like, this is in terms of like the real double helix of American political economic debate over the last, century. What we had is a vision of top-down corporatist control, which was put out there by the bull moose people, by Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. And then you had a vision of democratic, distribution of power and opportunity, and that was Brandeis and Wilson and FDR. And it's like, and what Galbraith did, it was Veblen, then Galbraith, they carried this idea of command and control forward, and they brought it into our system. And consumerism was just it was the package in which a vision of command and control was delivered to people. And the result is what we have today, which is massive concentration of power. We have command and control corporations that are in the middle of our society that are direct and imminent threats to our democracy. Google, Facebook, and Amazon. We don't deal with them. We have no democracy. It is over.
Thanks, Barry. Actually,
so who gave us that? Who gave us that? It was Galbraith operating through this concept.
Thank you, Barry. That actually is a good transition to the question I wanted to invoke. And I was going to say, until you made that last comment, we were remiss in that talking for an hour, we spent more time talking about the big three in the auto industry than we had about the digital giants, who are obviously, that's a lot of what's driving the discussion on antitrust today. And we have a good question from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name, David Papale. How do you approach thoughts on antitrust in this new digital economy, where platforms having substantial market control can deliver inherently better products and value to consumers? As a naive example, consumers can generally only pick one phone platform, Android versus iOS. But the bigger their platform is, the more value they will receive, more apps, tools, support available. So I guess the question is, how much does a digital economy change the calculations and the assumptions of how we look at antitrust and some of these questions? Barry, you're nodding your head or shaking your head, so go first.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the thing is what the questioner was getting at is, the effects of networks. When you have, and networks are important. It's like, and Apple, iOS, it's a network. Google, properly understood, it's actually a cluster of networks. We've had networks in our society, essential networks that we wanted to benefit from well more than 150 years. The railroad networks and the telegraph networks, and then later the telephone networks, and then the electrical networks. We figured out how to master all of these networks and make them work for us. It's called, there's a variety of different terms. Common carriage is the basic, the thing that we want to apply, which is, If you have a network, you have to treat everybody the same. You have to give them the same service in the same terms, at the same price, in the order in which they come. It's really simple. And the only corporations, the only network corporations that have never had this set of laws applied to them are Google, Facebook, Amazon, and then I guess we can throw in Apple and Microsoft just for fun, but really Google, Facebook, and Amazon. It's easy to fix. We know what to do. It's essential. We've been doing this for 400 years. That's what the statute of monopolies was about. Rule of law.
Bill or Christina, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think the issue is not the realization of benefits from expanded size. It's other things you might do to make sure that that position becomes unassailable and that no one else can try to create the other network. I would say if we look back at the expectations that our Congress brought to the adoption of the Sherman Act, to go back to the period, Barry's quote from Senator Sherman, I'm persuaded by Jim May, former colleague at American University, who says if you were to ask Congress that question and said, aren't you going to be giving up, aren't you overlooking scale and scope? Aren't you assuming that scale and scope economies can't be powerful when you look at large firms? And Jim would say that was a bit of a blind spot. I mean, this is Jim's idea, not mine, that they would have said, the only way you can become big and powerful and stay that way is by using improper means, buying up rivals, using exclusive dealing arrangements. They would have said, there's no way that you can account for large corporate size except by recourse to these other techniques, and that's what we're going to try to attack. At least part of the modern understanding, I mean, this is partly Alfred Chandler, others who said what they overlooked was that you could become large by reason of good practices alone. Now, how long you would stay that way was an open question, and that's where dealing with the practices, the mergers, these other structural changes was important. But I don't think our Congress in 1890 or 1914 acknowledged that possibility, that we might have big firms because of these effects. But let's assume for a second that they missed that issue and that these positive phenomena do account for size. That does not tell you that there is not a role for oversight dealing with the kinds of behavior that you use to suppress the kinds of firms that were you at an earlier time, that keep you from emerging in another form at a later time.
Right.
Christina, let's turn it over to you.
I really want to deal with this because I want to take somewhat issue with the premise of David's question. He seems to posit there's some sort of trade-off, right, between platforms having substantial market control, but then delivering inherently better products. And so somehow there is some trade-off. I don't think I see it that way. I think that we've understood what is the underlying drivers, the economic drivers that lead to size, the economies of scale and scope and the network effects and the data economies of scope. All of that by now is understood. We buried under reports that have been making that point clearly. But you cannot, although we recognize that these platforms generate products that are useful and we all like and we all use, the big missing point here is the counterfactual. We do not know what a world in which competition was more active would have delivered in the way of these products and value to consumers. So this is not something we can state as a starting point. We are missing at this point in time entirely a notion of what the alternative would have been. What we do know, though, is that conduct is problematic and concerning, because we do know that in order to protect these monopolies that have been created, we see envelopment as being something which is practiced very widely, extending, swinging, user bases from one market to the next, and effectively preventing others or reducing the oxygen that others have to develop their alternatives. So the lack of alternatives is what stares it in the face, and we cannot take a position that says, well, they've done a lot of good things and therefore we stop there. And we actually are in a position where we are in great difficulty yet understanding some of this and applying them in a constructive way. Think about how the monetization of data is the key driver for much of the conduct that we see. And yet we see agencies in antitrust still scratching their head and saying, I don't quite know how to prove that the monetization of data can be problematic. So I'll let it go. I'll let Google Fitbit go. You know, give Google Health data, what can possibly go wrong? But yeah, you know, I don't know quite how to calculate the value of that incremental data. So that's where the real problem is and the limitations of antitrust as we see it now. We are not doing exploitation well. We are not understanding the value of data. We're not pursuing theories around this in a way that is effective. And, you know, maybe regulation will do better. I don't know. But this is really the big question staring us in the face.
Thank you. That's a great conclusion to that segment. So we have about 5 minutes left. I suspect that we'll get maybe one question in there, and I'm going to actually batch a bunch of questions from the audience that are on a similar theme, taking this back to the combination of antitrust and liberty and democracy. Stephen Slivis asks that accepting that the premise that large concentrations of economic power pose a potential threat to economic liberty, should antitrust and competition law be the sole or primary focus for addressing this threat, or wouldn't campaign finance help limit this? Similarly, Guy Rolnick asks whether consumer welfare should also include political power to influence laws and regulations. And Brent Hweth asks, should firm participation in political process be as important component of competition policy? Lobbying to shape market structure is part of a firm strategy. So let's go to those questions again, all around the question of competition policy, political influence, campaign finance. Who wants to take that on first?
I think it's unmistakable that, you know, let's assume we've created powerful positions of market power, and they're valuable. They generate lucrative streams of income and give the holders of those shares and the business managers tremendous benefits. They have incentives to spend baskets of what they get in order to keep them. And one way to keep them is to go into the political process and say, give me shelter. So a concern that one has is certainly, what do they do with what they have? And how do they accumulate it? How do they apply it? What are the solutions? Campaign finance, that's one. Disclosure of lobbying activities, that's another. Something as basic as a ledger in each legislator's office that's made available to the public about who you saw and what you talked about. A host of measures to begin by making transparent those interactions, addressing the way that we pay for political campaigns and finance those campaigns, absolutely is part of the process. But at the same time, maybe we need EU-type restrictions on the ability of firms to elicit the sorts of restrictions that they want to protect themselves. State aid policy, where I hold an auction, I'm dominant, I'm powerful, I have billions, but I still want hard-strapped cities to give me a little bit more. State aid policy. How about an examination of the mechanisms by which large enterprises use a host of frontiers, and Barry correctly mentioned the range of policy instruments. It's trade, it's public procurement, all the mechanisms, that levers I can pull to protect myself. A broader notion of competition policy would formulate a program to try to address all of that.
Great, thanks,
yeah.
Bill. I'm sorry to cut you off. We've got 2 minutes left.
No, sure.
No, just 2 minutes left, and I wanted, Christina, since he invoked Europe, I don't know if you want to go next, and then Barry.
No, I'll let Barry go, and then
Okay.
I'll think if there's something to add.
All right, go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, well, thanks. You know, I think, I mean, the most important thing to understand here is that size is not the problem. Corruption of the government is not per se the problem. It's like the first thing we have to aim at is neutralization of what is powerful. That's what the Constitution was. We had something all powerful, the state. How do you neutralize it? Through checks and balances. The purpose of antitrust, checks and balances within the political economy. Most important part of that is the goal is neutralization. Neutralization of what must be big. When you have something really big, and we will have things that are really big, could be a railroad, it could be the sort of functions on the internet. That's really big. You must neutralize it. When I wrote Cornered, published Cornered 11 years ago, the point was to say, hey, we got really big things. Let's relearn the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's time for us to relearn the Interstate Commerce Act 3 years before that, 1887. We must neutralize Google, Facebook, and Amazon, because right now they use their power to manipulate us, to control us, to extort us, to impose fear on us. That's what makes it so dangerous. It's like big can be made safe. The way we know how to do that. And if we make it safe, all of those amazing technologies and those ideas and all of the engineers and scientists working in that space, they all become safe. They become good. They become pathways to a better world. Anti-monopoly is the way to a better future.
Got it. Thanks, Barry. Christina, do you want to wrap us up, or?
I mean, I don't have much to add other than certainly from a European perspective, there's only two ways. Either we are really dialing up antitrust in a way that is much more powerful than we've done so far, and we take into account really the big picture exploitation that is confronting us, or we do regulation properly, perhaps both, but I would not want to see just the telecom style regulation applied there. So I think, as I said, Europe is under construction, but watch this space. There is a lot happening.
Great. Well, I want to thank first our panelists for a fantastic discussion. My apologies for having to cut you off, and apologies to the audience for not getting to all the great questions that you asked, but clearly this is a rich topic, and I hope it's one that conversation we can continue in the coming days, weeks, and months in different forms, and I'm sure we will. And with that, I will thank all of you on behalf of the Stigler Center, and wishing you all staying safe and
Thank you.
sane. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Jake.
you.
Thank you.
Christina, Barry, thanks.
Bye.
Yep.